Imagine the dinner party. High-ranking Roman senators forced to dine in a marble stable where their host, a white stallion named Incitatus, ate his golden grain from a manger carved entirely of imported ivory. He wore blankets of royal purple. The two most detailed Roman chroniclers, writing only decades later, confirmed the precise inventory of this equine palace. Was this truly the act of a madman, or something far more calculated? Why spend a fortune, the equivalent annual salaries of 18 dedicated servants, simply to humiliate the Senate? The official records, the fasti, confirm Incitatus never took the consulship. The truth lies in the forensic evidence, the materials, the gold flakes, the forced subservience. What if the most extravagant act wasn't the gold, but the specific legal contradiction Caligula engineered, revealing a targeted intellectual malice that redefined the very nature of Roman law? Join us as we track the cost of absolute power. Tonight, we are at the edge of the Palatine Hill, in a furnished house built specifically not for a man, but for a horse. A structure erected near the sacred boundary of the city and dedicated entirely to the indulgence of Incitatus. Picture the air, heavy and rich, not with exotic perfumes, but with the cold, sharp scent of expensive, imported marble that lines the walls, clashing unnaturally with the sweet, humid musk of a supremely pampered animal. The Roman senators, men whose every ancestor was a celebrated conqueror, are seated stiffly on couches imported from Greece, compelled to stare at the horse, Incitatus, the self-proclaimed host, standing calmly while servants attend to his every need. Listen closely. There is the faint, unsettling clink of Caligula's golden goblets as he pours a libation, drinking a formal toast to the horse's salus, his health and well-being, but overriding that is the strained silence of the senators themselves, their voices low, bound by a terror more immediate than any battlefield. These men, the political masters of the Mediterranean, are being deliberately and comprehensively diminished, their dignity eroded by this extravagant, focused performance. The emperor forces them into an intimate, shared absurdity, ensuring that every dignitary present becomes an uncomfortable witness, and therefore an accomplice to the calculated desecration of Roman tradition. This entire bizarre apparatus, from the prized ivory manger to the full complement of slaves assigned only to serve the horse's dinner guests, represents a chilling mechanism of control, a carefully executed humiliation designed to test the limits of senatorial subservience. They are here not just to eat, but to absorb the visual insult. The dark, rich purple blanket draped over the animal's back, a color previously reserved for imperial triumph and high status. A color that screams of political position none of them dare challenge. This is not just a party. It is a frighteningly effective display of power so total that the emperor can rewrite reality and force the entire ruling class to play along in the charade. But the question remains, the one that mainstream history fails to answer. Was this all merely a spoiled child's prank, the result of a mind descending into clinical madness? Or was it a cold, calculated campaign designed to expose the very hollowness of their ancient republic and its institutions? To find the true answer, we must look beyond the spectacle of this dinner party, beyond the glimmer of gold flakes in the horse's feed, and examine the physical dimensions and the financial weight of this equine cult, a massive financial expenditure that targeted the stability of the Roman treasury itself. The air is still rank with the scent of forced civility and expensive horse sweat, but let's pivot from the sensory nightmare of that dinner party to the shocking political accusation that Caligula planned to designate Incitatus as a Roman consul, one of the two highest magistracies in the empire. This is the headline claim, the legend that has endured for 2 millennia, turning Caligula into the ultimate symbol of imperial insanity. But we have to ask a foundational question, one that separates gossip from forensic truth. Did it actually happen? And the uncomfortable answer is no. Ancient sources are unambiguous. The horse was never made a consul. We know this because the consular records, the official fasti, are largely accounted for during Caligula's reign, and Incitatus is absent from the definitive list of magistrates. So the central plot point of the legend is factually hollow, a phantom threat. But wait, why would both Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing decades later, include this highly specific claim? Why maintain the lie if the paperwork proves otherwise? The answer reveals a far more chilling reality than simple madness. The consulship under the empire was largely an honorific office, used by the emperor to reward loyalists. A powerful title, yes, but fundamentally devoid of the real power it once held in the Republic. By continually issuing the threat to elevate Incitatus, Caligula was engaging in calculated, precise political warfare. He was rubbing the Senate's face in the grim truth of their own powerlessness. He was daring them to protest, daring them to complain that a high-ranking aristocrat was a better fit for the job than a white chariot stallion. The clear implication, whispered in fear through the courts and barracks, was that a horse was equally, if not more, qualified to execute the duties of a senator. This wasn't the rambling delusion of a lunatic. This was a deliberate, sharp-edged weapon used to dismantle the Roman aristocracy's remaining self-respect. We have the forensic evidence of the insult in the physical objects he lavished upon the horse: the jeweled collar, the house, the staff of 18 servants, all of which quantify the economic scale of the humiliation. But this political game went even deeper, moving from the realm of secular law, where he threatened the consulship, into the sacred domain of Roman religion. The ultimate, most destructive threat was reserved for an office that went beyond political titles, an office that held the very integrity of Roman tradition in its grip. We have yet to examine the proof that Caligula planned to make Incitatus a priest, and the specific religious prohibition that plan violated is perhaps the most shocking piece of calculated malice in this entire dark saga. We established that the threat of the consulship was a ghost, a political weapon rather than an enacted law, which means we are no longer investigating madness, but rather a cold, terrifying performance of dominance. So let us turn our attention to the author of that performance, Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history by the strange, juvenile nickname Caligula, which translates literally to Little Boots, an ironic moniker dating back to his childhood when he wore miniature military sandals while accompanying his father on campaign. He inherited the throne in 37 AD, and while the early days promised stability, his 4-year reign became synonymous with cruelty, decadence, and an increasing detachment from reality. But here is the critical investigative hurdle. Almost everything we know about this emperor, the lurid tales of debauchery, the alleged insanity, the casual brutality, comes primarily from chroniclers like Suetonius, who wrote decades later in 121 AD, and Cassius Dio, who wrote a century and a half after Caligula's assassination in 41 AD. And we must acknowledge that their narratives are heavily filtered through what scholars call the Black Tradition, a body of propaganda created by the very senatorial class Caligula spent his entire reign humiliating and threatening. These writers had every reason to exaggerate, to sensationalize, and to fabricate the extent of his purported madness in order to justify his murder and demonize the Julio-Claudian line. Yet the forensic evidence shows that Caligula possessed the means and the motive to execute the staggering expenditures attributed to Incitatus. What if the extravagant acts were not the chaotic bursts of a deranged mind, but the highly focused execution of a plan intended to dismantle Roman tradition using absurdity as its primary tool? Modern historians now argue that his treatment of Incitatus was an elaborate form of political satire. A pointed campaign designed to demonstrate the Senate's utter lack of merit by comparing them favorably to a racehorse. This shifts the terror from random violence to a more chilling, calculated maliciousness. The emperor wasn't just wealthy, he was strategically wasteful. And to truly gauge the depth of his contempt for the Roman elite, we must now move from the realm of political theory to cold, hard currency, leaving behind the biased accounts of the historians. We need the physical measurements, the material costs, and the documented labor to understand the sheer financial weight of making a horse functionally equivalent to a living god. And we begin with the architecture of the animal's life, the cost of the marble, and the horrifying extravagance of the very trough from which Incitatus ate, revealing a precise organizational structure aimed at public offense. We leave the historical ambiguities of Dio and Suetonius now and turn our focus to the magnificent living instrument of the emperor's calculated mockery, the animal known as Incitatus, whose name itself, Latin for impetuous or swift, already suggests a pedigree of high performance, fitting for a celebrated chariot race stallion imported from Hispania, which was a major source for the finest Roman horses. Caligula's devotion to this specific animal was not a casual hobby. It was an all-consuming mania, rooted in his fanatical loyalty to one of the great racing teams of the era, the notorious Greens. In Rome, the Circus Maximus was the heart of the city's passion, and chariot races were not mere sport. They were dangerous, high-stakes spectacles of wealth, politics, and social allegiance. By centering his entire life, his imperial resources, and his political threats on Incitatus, the emperor elevated this white stallion to the role of a political figurehead, the living, breathing, sleek-muscled vanguard of his own disdain for the Senate. We must understand that for Caligula, this horse was perfection, a sublime creature of speed and power, untainted by the political corruption he believed festered in the human elite. He didn't just love Incitatus, he saw him as a rival to the gods themselves, a manifestation of pure, unbridled excellence that far surpassed any flabby, speechifying aristocrat. This devotion wasn't just emotional, it was material, taking on a specific, horrifying organizational pattern that we can analyze like a forensic scientist analyzing a crime scene. It began with the physical housing, creating an environment that was not just luxurious, but a complete desecration of traditional Roman status. This is where we move from the anecdotal legend to the undeniable, verifiable facts of the emperor's calculated structure of abuse. Prepare yourself for the sheer, staggering cost of a horse's dignity, beginning with the marble walls and the forbidden material that Caligula chose for his eating vessel. We move now from the horse's political elevation to the quantifiable proof of his status, beginning with his residence. Suetonius is clear. The champion stallion's stable was constructed not of common brick or wood, but of marble, the cold, pristine stone imported at immense cost and typically reserved only for the most sacred temples, imperial palaces, or major public works. Picture the oppressive stillness of that compound, likely situated in the bustling valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills, right next to the thundering heart of Roman life, the Circus Maximus. By choosing this material, Caligula didn't just give his horse luxury. He gave it architectural status equal to the apparatus of the state itself, creating a profound visual anomaly that assaulted the sensibilities of every Roman official who passed by. The simple act of walling the horse's home in polished stone, a desecration of material dignity, was a cold, hard measurement of the emperor's contempt. The marble itself becomes a forensic artifact, confirming the immense scale of this opulent undertaking, proving that the malice wasn't random, but part of a focused organizational plan. But the marble stable was only the frame for a far greater insult, because the contents of that stable, specifically the vessel from which Incitatus ate, reveal an economic waste so calculated, so specific, that it moves beyond mere extravagance and into the territory of deliberate, targeted abuse. We must now turn our attention to the material evidence that cost Rome thousands of denarii, the forbidden substance used to carve the animal's feeding trough. The marble walls of Incitatus's stable only served as the frame for the truly astonishing, quantifiable financial perversion at the heart of this story, because the manger, the simple feeding trough from which the horse ate, was carved entirely of ivory. We must pause here and understand the sheer financial magnitude of this singular object. Ivory was a restricted, immensely valuable luxury, imported over vast distances, often from Africa or India, along perilous trade routes. And this wasn't just a trinket. This was a large, heavy feeding trough designed to withstand the daily use of a fully grown chariot stallion. For a forensic appraisal, we know that raw ivory was valued at approximately 150 denarii for just 300 grams, meaning the construction of Incitatus's manger represented a diversion of imperial funds that cost thousands upon thousands of denarii. But the real horror is not the price. It is the purpose. This exotic material was traditionally reserved in the Roman world for religious statuary, for the magnificent visible representations of the gods themselves. Caligula was, with terrifying clarity, converting sacred capital into an animal's slobber-filled feeding vessel, deliberately executing a calculated organization of waste designed to prove he was above the fundamental laws of supply, demand, and spiritual dignity. This was not merely extravagance. It was psychological warfare waged with exotic goods, making a clear statement of economic contempt that resonated through every layer of Roman society. The emperor valued his horse's daily comfort more than the revered integrity of the state treasury and religious tradition. Yet the cost of the material structure was only half of the equation. The greater, more enduring financial burden and the ultimate tool of humiliation was the immense human cost required to maintain this single animal's obscene life, an expense we can quantify with chilling precision. We established that the ivory manger, priced at 150 denarii for 300 grams of raw ivory, was an economic crime against the Republic's resources. But the true brilliance of Caligula's malicious organization was visible only when Incitatus stepped out of his marble stable, a walking four-legged affront to the aristocracy, draped head to hoof in the material language of royalty and high office. Forget the cold marble and the gleaming ivory. Focus on the texture of the cloth, because Incitatus was covered entirely in purple blankets, the deep, intense color derived from laboriously crushed murex snails. A dye so restricted and notoriously expensive that its value often commanded the weight of gold itself. This was not merely the color of wealth, it was the color of the emperor, and by wrapping his horse in it, Caligula was proclaiming Incitatus's quasi-divine, untouchable status to every citizen in Rome, visually violating the sumptuary laws that governed the very appearance of the elite. Adding to this staggering material expense was the horse's harness, which was not simple leather, but a blinding display of wealth, meticulously decorated with rare and precious stones or jewels, turning the magnificent white stallion into a glimmering icon of imperial ego, a god on four hooves, ready to be worshipped. But here is the sharpest, most targeted insult. The detail that confirms this was political satire, and not just madness. Sources confirm Incitatus also wore fine cloths edged with red borders, a direct, precise mimicry of the tunica clava, the narrow red stripe that marked a Roman senator. Think about that shocking contrast, a horse clad in the forbidden color of divinity and simultaneously wearing the unmistakable public uniform of the very men Caligula despised, forcing them to look upon an animal that literally wore their reduced status as a decorative joke. It was a terrifyingly simple, nonverbal message. This horse is not just better than you. He is your superior. He is your replacement, and I, the emperor, can make him wear your dignity and your wealth as a bridle. The material evidence confirms the scale of the visual crime. But the scale of the human crime, the specific, meticulous staff required to maintain this walking insult, is the next layer of forensic proof, confirming the terrifying economic precision of the emperor's operations. How many human lives and how many legionary salaries were spent simply to ensure this horse's daily wardrobe was insulting enough? We quantify the true devastating cost next. The purple-dyed, red-bordered blanket was a stunning visual insult, but the true magnitude of Caligula's malicious organization is revealed by the expense of the human labor required to maintain this opulent farce, an economic crime quantifiable with chilling precision. We possess the cold, verifiable statistic. Incitatus was not just cared for, he was attended by a dedicated staff of 18 servants, a workforce that approximated the labor pool of a wealthy senatorial household, all dedicated solely to polishing marble, managing the purple regalia, and preparing the horse's bizarre schedule. To understand the true financial horror, we must calculate this cost against the prevailing standards of the Roman state. A Roman legionary, the celebrated backbone of the empire, earned an annual stipend of approximately 900 sesterces during this period. This means the minimal annual expenditure on Incitatus's staff, just their wages, not accounting for the cost of the ivory or the imported purple dye, totaled at least 16,200 sesterces, a sum large enough to fund nearly 20 experienced soldiers for a full year. This was not merely the waste of money. It was the calculated, focused deployment of imperial funds to prove that the operational life of one pampered animal was economically equivalent to a small military unit, a deliberate distortion of priorities designed to rub the Senate's nose in the depth of their own powerlessness. The emperor was demonstrating with brutal clarity that human public service and military sacrifice were less valuable than the whims of his chosen creature. Every one of those 18 servants was a visible, living testament to the emperor's contempt for traditional Roman virtues and a functionary in this meticulously organized structure of fiscal abuse. Yet all the marble, the jewels, and the immense staff only served one final escalating purpose: to feed the beast in a manner so sacrilegious, so ostentatiously wasteful, that the sheer absurdity of the act becomes the final, most visceral piece of forensic evidence. We must now turn to the most notorious, most disturbing detail of Incitatus's daily routine, the ritual that reveals the truly bottomless nature of Caligula's calculated extravagance. The astonishing, shimmering material he forced his servants to mix into the horse's dinner. The vast human effort, costing the price of 2 military cohorts, was all organized into a highly focused structure aimed at one final terrifying ritual: the horse's daily meal. And this is where the story descends from economic abuse into sheer, deliberate sacrilege. But it gets worse. Wait until you see the disturbing truth of what this horse ate. Cassius Dio, the later chronicler, provides us with the specific, horrifying detail that defines the height of Caligula's extravagance. Servants routinely fed Incitatus oats mixed with gold flakes. Stop and truly visualize the scene in that cold, expensive ivory manger. The simple, wholesome texture of the Roman grain, the staple diet of common citizens who struggled daily to earn their denarii, suddenly interrupted and degraded by a scattering of shimmering, non-oxidizing metal. This was not the subtle application of gold leaf for garnish. This was the physical inclusion of currency, of the very foundation of the empire's wealth, directly into animal feed, a terrifying fusion of luxury and mundanity. This singular daily ritual transformed the simple act of feeding from sustenance into a breathtakingly profane performance of absolute dominion. Gold, the most stable and symbolically powerful asset in the Roman world, was literally being ingested and excreted by a racehorse, an act that sent a clear, chilling message to the citizens. The emperor has such boundless control over the treasury that he can afford to turn the symbol of Rome's financial stability into mere digestive waste. This was a calculated display of financial power, a deliberate action aimed at proving the empire's resources were infinitely disposable, and it was a direct insult to the concept of value itself. If Caligula could afford to feed a single animal its weight in gold over the course of a year, imagine the limitless resources he believed he held over the lives of his subjects, reinforcing the terrifying implication that human life held less concrete value than the material used for the horse's breakfast. We have now quantified the architectural crime with the marble toy, the economic crime with the 18 servants, and the sacrilegious crime with the gold-flecked diet. But all of this meticulously organized extravagance was primarily designed to protect one thing above all: the horse's performance on the track, his ability to run and win. And Caligula enforced that need not just through immense wealth, but through the terrifying application of absolute military power over the vibrant, teeming city of Rome. The ultimate expression of his tyranny was reserved not for the Senate in their chambers, but for the common citizen in the streets, imposing a physical sensory violation on an entire neighborhood, forcing an unnaturally quiet, suffocating environment on the most boisterous city in the world. The sensory detail of enforced silence, an order policed by legionaries, was a far greater measure of tyranny than any amount of gold. And we must now listen closely to the documented lack of sound to understand the terrifying physical extent of Caligula's obsession. The vast human effort costing the price of 2 military cohorts was all focused on one thing: Incitatus's racing performance. The gold flakes in his ivory manger proved Caligula's limitless financial contempt, but the true terror was not what he spent, but what he demanded of the living city around the Circus Maximus. This is the most stunning physical imposition of Caligula's power on the lives of ordinary Romans. Suetonius provides the shocking forensic detail. The day before a race, Caligula deployed soldiers throughout the neighborhood to issue a terrifying, unprecedented command. They were to order the entire vicinity to be silent so that Incitatus would not be disturbed by any noise. Can you imagine the sound, or lack thereof, of enforced unnatural quietness in the loud, chaotic heart of ancient Rome? Rome was not a quiet city. It was a perpetual, deafening roar. The clatter of bronze chariot wheels on cobblestones, the metallic clang of the blacksmiths, the ceaseless, aggressive haggling of vendors in the forum, the thousands of footsteps echoing in narrow Vicus streets. All of this, the vital, cacophonous sound of Roman life, was extinguished by military decree, simply so the emperor's horse could concentrate, transforming a fundamental civic right into a punishable offense. The very absence of noise becomes the most damning sensory detail, a suffocating vacuum policed by the emperor's guard. By using the army to enforce his horse's nap, Caligula demonstrated that the comfort of one animal, who ate gold flakes and slept in marble, superseded the entire human experience, and the functioning economy of his capital. The common laborer, already struggling to live on a pittance, now faced military action if their normal household noise disrupted the precious slumber of a beast whose staff cost the equivalent of 20 legionary salaries. This was an act of public humiliation meticulously orchestrated through the application of force, proving that Caligula possessed complete, absolute dominion over the physical world. This horrifying control over the sensory environment, however, was merely a precursor to his ultimate, most calculated violation, one that required not military strength, but a specific, chilling mastery of Roman religious law itself. We have quantified the wealth and the oppression. Now we must examine the specific legal impossibility that confirms Caligula's malice was terrifyingly precise. The soldiers who enforced the Edict of Silence proved Caligula's physical dominion, but the ultimate, enduring insult was rooted in the political specter he continuously invoked. The consulship, the highest civilian office in the world, promised to an animal who ate gold flakes. This is the central lie, the one that must be forensically dismantled, because the official records confirm that Incitatus was never made a consul. We know this because the consular lists, the fasti, which meticulously tracked Rome's magistrates, have surprisingly few gaps for the years 37 to 41 AD, and Incitatus is glaringly absent from that definitive record. Furthermore, the Senate's official proceedings, the Acta Senatus, were already tightly controlled and suppressed by previous emperors, meaning Caligula had every means to formalize the honor if he had genuinely wished, yet the documentation does not exist, confirming the non-event. The consulship was not a reality. It was a potent, persistent threat, a weaponized joke deployed with calculated maliciousness to show the aristocracy that their most coveted honor was worthless, that their dignity could be casually conferred upon a purple-draped beast in his marble stable. A threat, historians suggest, was far more terrifying than the accomplished fact, because it kept the entire senatorial class permanently frozen in a state of anticipatory dread, continually awaiting the moment when the emperor would finally force them to share their sacred seats of government with a horse. But Caligula did not stop at secular politics. He reserved his most precise, his most shocking organizational violation for the realm of the divine, moving beyond political insult to commit a specific documented act of religious blasphemy that reveals the true intellectual cruelty behind his actions. He planned to appoint Incitatus as a priest, and the specific legal restriction that appointment violated is the ultimate evidence that the emperor was not simply mad, but a master of specific, destructive contradiction. The soldiers who enforced the Edict of Silence proved Caligula's physical dominion, but the ultimate, enduring insult was rooted in the political specter he continuously invoked, the consulship, the highest civilian office in the world, promised to an animal who ate gold flakes. This is the central lie, the one that must be forensically dismantled, because the official records confirm that Incitatus was never made a consul. We know this because the consular lists, the fasti, which meticulously tracked Rome's magistrates, have surprisingly few gaps for the years 37 to 41 AD, and Incitatus is glaringly absent from that definitive record. Furthermore, the Senate's official proceedings, the Acta Senatus, were already tightly controlled and suppressed by previous emperors, meaning Caligula had every means to formalize the honor if he had genuinely wished, yet the documentation does not exist, confirming the non-event. The consulship was not a reality. It was a potent, persistent threat, a weaponized joke deployed with calculated maliciousness to show the aristocracy that their most coveted honor was worthless, that their dignity could be casually conferred upon a purple-draped beast in his marble stable. A threat, historians suggest, was far more terrifying than the accomplished fact, because it kept the entire senatorial class permanently frozen in a state of anticipatory dread, continually awaiting the moment when the emperor would finally force them to share their sacred seats of government with a horse. But Caligula did not stop at secular politics. He reserved his most precise, his most shocking organizational violation for the realm of the divine, moving beyond political insult to commit a specific documented act of religious blasphemy that reveals the true intellectual cruelty behind his actions. He planned to appoint Incitatus as a priest, and the specific legal restriction that appointment violated is the ultimate evidence that the emperor was not simply mad, but a master of specific destructive contradiction. This brings us to the ultimate legal paradox, the explosive core of Caligula's calculated maliciousness. Cassius Dio confirms that the emperor designated Incitatus as a priest, intending to co-opt him as his own, placing the animal in a role equated with the highest levels of Roman piety, but this act, unlike the consulship, targeted a specific ancient sacred law known as mos maiorum. This is the moment where the emperor's actions shift from political theater to an absolute chilling violation of the divine order, because the highest order of priests in Rome, the Flamen Dialis, the very priest most associated with Jupiter, a god Caligula often mimicked, was bound by dozens of crippling ritual restrictions, and the single most critical prohibition was this: the flamen diellis was explicitly forbidden to ride a horse. Think about the sheer, targeted profanity of that fact. Incitatus was a prize racehorse, a beast whose entire glorious existence was predicated on being ridden, trained, and spurred to victory. Yet Caligula planned to appoint him to the only sacred office in the empire that made the simple act of sitting on his back a profound legal blasphemy. This wasn't the rambling of a lunatic. This was a precise, terrifyingly effective intellectual crime. Caligula engineered a situation of specific legal and religious impossibility, creating a paradox that could only be resolved by the complete destruction of ancient tradition. His message was clear. My power does not just supersede the Senate, it can logically contradict the venerable laws established by the gods and your ancestors. This astonishing revelation completely alters the historical verdict, suggesting the lurid tales were less about insanity and more about an extremely well-organized, strategic campaign of power abuse. Yet, while the ancient sources meticulously record the cost of the ivory manger and the staff of 18 servants, they often omit the broader context, forcing modern scholars to piece together the forensic environment of Caligula's empire, specifically the newly discovered documents and archaeological remnants that confirm his sheer capacity for this level of systematic extravagance. The revelation that Caligula engineered a legal impossibility, the riding priest paradox, completely demolishes the simple, convenient claim of madness. This was a chilling intellectual application of absolute power. Consequently, modern historians, particularly those whose seminal works have been substantially revised or published within the last few decades, fundamentally reject the simplistic lunatic label assigned by the biased ancient chroniclers who spread the black tradition. Leading scholars like Alois Winterling and Anthony A. Barrett argue that the entire Incitatus saga, from the purple regalia to the Edict of Silence, was an elaborate, politically targeted satire or a magnificent prank designed specifically to ridicule and provoke the Senate, making a pointed, undeniable statement that an animal could perform their duties just as well as any cowed aristocrat. The scale of the marble stables and the immense cost of the ivory. Manger might seem, on the surface, impossible to sustain, yet recent archaeological findings provide a crucial physical validation of Caligula's capacity for such obscene vanity and waste. While we still lack a hidden scroll detailing the exact weight of the gold flakes fed to Incitatus, major projects since the early 2010s have unearthed the expansive remains of Caligula's palace and lavish gardens on the Esquiline Hill, and startling discoveries have been made deep beneath the streets near the Vatican, confirming the emperor's physical ability to fund an empire of unparalleled opulence. These unearthed ruins, documented in our own lifetime, prove that the astonishing scale of extravagance described, the dedicated staff of 18 servants, the gilded oats, the architectural insanity, was entirely feasible within his imperial operations, confirming the general veracity of the descriptions, if not the political motive behind them. This combination of newly confirmed economic data, legal fact, and new archaeological context forces us toward a dark and unifying conclusion. Caligula was not just deranged, he was executing a horrifying, focused organizational strategy designed to dismantle the Roman state's dignity by making the aristocracy complicit in their own degradation. The final, most disturbing question remains, the one that defines this entire episode and which we must confront next. If Caligula only threatened the consulship and only threatened the priesthood, why did the senators, the supposed protectors of the Republic, allow themselves to be invited to his horse's house and drink to its health? The cost of their forced submission reveals the true, absolute terror that defined his 4-year reign. The discovery of Caligula's specific, calculated legal violation, the priest who could not ride, confirms that we are dealing with a cold master of manipulation, not a lunatic, and this horrifying intellectual precision brings us to the final, necessary crescendo of terror: the compulsory dinner parties. If the consulship was a ghost and the priesthood a calculated insult, the true horror resided in the constant, inescapable social mechanism that forced the Senate into absolute degradation, compelling them to sit, silent and subservient, in the horse's furnished house for formal dining events. Picture the scene one last time, the ultimate spectacle of forced fealty. The dignitaries, men who controlled armies and provinces, compelled to attend the dinner parties Incitatus would formally invite them to, surrounded by the marble walls of his stable compound, sitting in rigid discomfort while their host, the racehorse, stood draped in the purple regalia that mocked their own class. This was the moment of ultimate organized humiliation, where Caligula would raise his golden goblet and force every powerful man present to pour libations and drink a toast to the horse's Salus, his health and well-being, an ancient ritual reserved for gods and emperors. The true terror was not the extravagance of the gold flakes in the oats, nor the colossal expense of the 18 servants. It was the psychological burden of having to perform total smiling compliance, knowing that this animal, who was simultaneously dressed as a senator and protected by a military-enforced edict of silence, was the physical manifestation of their total powerlessness. This was the dark climax. The absurdity was intentional, designed to make the powerful men of Rome complicit in their own moral downfall, proving that Caligula could not only strip them of their wealth and titles, but he could force them to choose subservience over self-respect. Their attendance, their forced toast, their quiet obedience in the face of the priesthood paradox. This was the evidence of absolute tyranny, where the line between political threat and personal reality was erased, leaving men with no choice but to participate in the emperor's grand, depraved performance. The true crime of the Incitatus saga, therefore, is not against the Roman treasury or Roman law, but against the core of human dignity itself, forcing men to become worse than the animal they were worshipping. But Caligula's story ends violently, and that fact forces us to ask one last haunting question. What did the emperor's bloody assassination ultimately resolve? And what does the enduring legend of the marble stable and the ivory manger tell us about the chilling, cyclical nature of absolute power and human nature itself? The dark spectacle of Incitatus, the horse who ate gold flakes and forced the silence of an entire Roman neighborhood, concludes, as all tyrannies eventually do, in blood and chaos, with Caligula's swift and brutal assassination in 41 AD. But the end of the emperor did not erase the evidence he left behind, and that evidence is what remains hauntingly relevant for us today. We began this forensic investigation seeking verifiable facts behind the legend, and what we found was not a tale of simple madness, but a chilling, meticulously organized campaign to weaponize absurdity, proving that the Roman state was so fundamentally broken that its very dignity could be mocked by a purple-draped animal. The total cost of the horse's life, the 16,200 sesterces required annually for the 18 servants, the strategic expense of the ivory manger, the physical reality of the marble stable, and the violation of the priesthood paradox, all confirm a horrifying intellectual precision, a master manipulator using economic and legal contradictions as his primary instruments of abuse. Yet the lasting, most disturbing legacy is not the emperor's depravity. It is the absolute requirement of complicity he imposed on his victims. The senators, men whose ancestors founded the Republic, sat in Incitatus's furnished house and drank to the health of the horse who wore their uniform, choosing immediate, silent submission over the slightest shred of self-respect. They did not protest the edict of silence. They did not refuse the golden goblet. They demonstrated that dignity, law, and even the sacred integrity of Roman tradition collapse instantly when faced with a ruler who is totally unbound by reality and possesses a chilling willingness to test the limits of what human beings will endure. The enduring truth of Incitatus, therefore, is not about the horse who almost became a consul, but about the terrifying capacity of men to submit to a clear, malicious structure of power, proving that the destruction of human nature and political norms is often more terrifying than the alleged madness that history books conveniently record. The true horror is asking yourself, in the face of such a precise, absurd tyranny, would you have raised the toast?